revolution, well, you know. Wait, that's the British invasion in 1964. We're talking about the 1770s, when the original American colonies fought back against their British mother country for independence. So let's get to that story right now. So in the last video, we talked about the French and Indian War and how the British ultimately, with the colonists' help, win that war against the French and their Indian allies. And the Treaty of 1763 is going to officially end the war and kick the French out of all the Ohio River Valley territory. This territory is prime for farming. American colonists are excited to move into this area and start using it themselves, and ultimately they do. But Pontiac's Rebellion takes place. Native Americans attack these Ohio River Valley settlers, and the British have to intervene to stop this Native American rebellion. Well, that's not too convenient for the British king, so ultimately he's going to draw this line, the Proclamation Line of 1763, in which he'll proclaim, you don't go past this line because natives will attack you. As you can see, the line cuts right through the Appalachian Mountains, so it's a natural border there. Now, colonists are upset with this. They were hoping to use this territory for themselves, and it's kind of like a strike one against the British Empire, where American colonists are relatively upset. Since these native incursions are a possibility in the future, the British keep troops on site in the American colonies indefinitely. They passed the Quartering Act of 1765, which requires that American colonists provide housing and food for these soldiers. 1 year prior to the Quartering Act, the British were trying to make back money from this French and Indian War debt, and one of the ways to do that was passing the Sugar Act of 1764. What's important to note, though, is that it's an indirect tax. The exact opposite of that would be a direct tax to the consumer, and that is what the next item, the Stamp Act of 1765, will be. This is a tax that was passed without colonial consent. In this case, it's a law that requires that they pay this tax on pretty much any paper good. The list includes almost anything you can think of as far as paper goods go, from newspapers, legal documents, and playing cards. You had to purchase this stamp for any of these paper goods, and it was a direct tax to the consumer buying the product. So this is why it's like the most egregious thing, why it upsets the colonists so much. It's that direct element of it. So what do the colonies do in response to the Stamp Act? Ultimately, they decide to form a Congress, to get together, to unite. And in their Stamp Act Congress, they decide they're going to boycott all British goods. And in this way, force the British to repeal the Stamp Act. Another group forms during this time called the Sons of Liberty. Sam Adams of Boston is kind of the ringleader of the Sons of Liberty. Some of the things they're known for are violent intimidation of tax collectors. Notice this primary source here. It says, Tuesday morning, December 17th, 1765, the true-born Sons of Liberty are desired to meet under Liberty Tree. And it says the time, this day, to hear the public resignation under oath of Andrew Oliver, distributor of stamps for the province of the Massachusetts Bay. A resignation? Yes. So there's this intimidation. The Sons of Liberty also famously tarred and feathered tax collectors, which is really awful. Stripping somebody down, pouring hot tar on them, and then throwing feathers on them that would stick, and it'd be humiliating. But also potentially you could die from the burns, and it's a terrible, terrible thing. But the Sons of Liberty are desperate and willing to take these measures. So the Stamp Act Congress will succeed. It will apply pressure economically to the British, and really it's merchants in Britain that are feeling the pain, the pinch of this economically, and are begging Parliament to repeal this. So the Stamp Act does get repealed a year later in 1766. Yay, Stamp Act Congress, they got something done there. They worked together and got something done. This teapot here is really interesting to look at. It was actually used in the 2017 DBQ, And the DBQ was on how American independence or ideas of it changed over time. And you could look at this as a great example of sourcing. So who made it? Source, teapot, made in England, 1766. That's the year the Stamp Act was repealed. Who applied the pressure to get this act repealed? Well, the American colonists did by not buying stuff that was British made. And British merchants really were the voice that was loudest back home in Britain that made the King and Parliament ultimately retract or repeal the Stamp Act. So here you see sort of the merchants of England trying to patch the mercantilist relationship up with the colonists so they could start making money again off the colonists, as that mercantilist relationship is supposed to do. So really neat artifact there to look at. But the American colonists don't come away unscathed. The British passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, that same year, and essentially it just says, we can tax you without your consent down the road. We just chose to repeal the Stamp Act, essentially. So you won this time, but we could do this again, which is important to know because they will. American colonists have divided opinions about the relationship with Britain at this time, but the vast majority want to stay loyal to the British Empire. They do not want to break away. Independence is not something they want at this time. And in the Hamilton musical, you look to Farmer Refuted. The song Farmer Refuted goes into this a little bit, where you see loyalists, aka Tories, not wanting to break from British rule. And then you've got the patriots like Alexander Hamilton who are pushing for this independence. The next monumental set of taxes on the American colonists would be the Townshend Acts in 1767, and that's on lead, paper, glass, and tea. The American response will be more boycotting. Boycotting will be a very common way of fighting back against the British. Get them where it hurts the most, their economy. In 1769, the Virginia House of Burgesses weighs in on this with the Virginia Resolves, and they say this is wrong. Taxation without representation is not okay. So in 1770, after the boycotts and the continual kind of pressing against the British Parliament, Parliament repeals the Townshend Acts. Colonists are really upset with the taxes and start to protest very openly. And this happens at the Boston Customs House regularly. But on March 5th, 1770, something goes down in front of that customs house. Customs house is where these import taxes are being paid to customs officials. And so on March 5th, 1770, colonists are congregating there. They're protesting. British soldiers are outside protecting the customs house, and colonists are whipping snowballs at them. And allegedly some of the snowballs had shells and stones inside them. So it could be pretty painful to the British troops who, you got to hand it to them, for a while were taking this abuse and doing nothing. And ultimately, something leads to one of those British troops firing on the crowd of colonists. It ultimately leads to 5 colonists dead. And this propaganda here that was created by Paul Revere. So this wood engraving here shows that the letters, or the word Customs House, has been changed to Butcher's Hall. It's clearly propaganda here. He's taking liberties to change what's in here to make it really one-sided, showing the British as these butchers. And the colonists are shown unarmed. That might not have fully been the case. Maybe they had clubs, and of course they were throwing the snowballs loaded with junk at them. But ultimately, this paints a picture of poor colonists being bullied by and murdered by British troops. A month later in April, the Townshend Acts are repealed, mostly due to the boycotts and the economic damage done to British trade. In 1773, the Tea Act is passed, and colonists are really upset because this is the drink of choice in British colonial America. So what will they do in response? You guessed it. Boycott. They will boycott British tea. A specific import of the British tea went to Boston Harbor, and you've heard this story before. The Boston Tea Party, as it's called, will be December 16th, 1773, when all of this tons of tea is sitting on ships in the Boston Harbor, refused by the American colonists to be brought on shore. the Sons of Liberty board these ships with the tea and start pouring all the tea into the Boston harbor. So what is the King of England's response? It's going to be the coercive acts, or as the colonists call them, the intolerable acts. These are passed in 1774, and it's a collection or set of different laws, one being the Port Act, the Boston Port Act, which closed the Boston port until they paid back all the damages for this tea that was tossed into the harbor. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the ability of the Massachusetts government to meet and convene. Town hall meetings that they love so much in New England were essentially shut down. The Administration of Justice Act was another intolerable act, and essentially here, say if you were an American smuggler and you were caught, you were sent back to Britain to be put on trial rather than allowed to stand trial here in the colonies. The other colonies feel terrible about this, so what will they do? Form a Congress. They met from September 5th to October 26th of 1774. They were in Philadelphia in Carpenter's Hall, and here you see kind of the makeup of who was present. There was sort of a spectrum of allegiance to the British here among the delegates that met. We had the conservatives who ultimately really wanted to stay loyal to the British and were hoping to just patch things up. We had the moderates who were leaning towards that as well, and that included George Washington, John Dickinson, and we had the radicals like Sam Adams, John Adams, his cousin, and Patrick Henry. These gentlemen are pushing for independence. Back in Massachusetts, in the county of Suffolk, they passed the Suffolk Resolves, which essentially said they disagreed with the Intolerable Acts, wanted them repealed, and were going to boycott British goods to make that happen. And in that Continental Congress going on in Philadelphia, they agreed that these Suffolk Resolves were good, it was a good measure, and that they, too, endorsed a boycott of British goods. They also, in this First Continental Congress, created the Continental Association. You could just call it the Association, and its job was to enforce the boycott, making sure that business owners were getting soft on the British and going back on these resolves. One of the other things the First Continental Congress agrees on is that if by May 1775 their colonial rights are still not being recognized, then we'll create another Second Continental Congress. Meanwhile, the British are sick and tired of the Sons of Liberty. They want to end this group altogether, and what better way to do that than to attack their leadership? So Sam Adams and John Hancock were among those primary members of the Sons of Liberty. John Hancock was known as this premier smuggler. What better targets essentially to go after? They also had the British got wind that there was a weapons depot of sorts, a weapons storage facility in Concord, Massachusetts, and they wanted to take that out. So the British go hunting for this. They are en route to Concord. Famously, this is where the Ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes and Sam Prescott comes in. They get word that the British are coming. They hop on their horses, ride off towards Lexington and Concord, and start shouting out that the British are coming, the British are coming. Local militias, nicknamed Minutemen, because they can get together in a minute's time, start packing, getting ready to face off against the British in the morning. So around 5 a.m. on April 19th, 1775, the Minutemen intercept the British troops on their way towards Concord. It's at Lexington Town Green. And this is famously known as the shot heard around the world that's fired off here as the American colonists fire at the British. Ultimately, the colonists, the Minutemen, do retreat with 8 American colonists dying. So the British did take Lexington and moved forward on towards Concord. When the British make it to Concord, they notice that the weapons storage is cleared out. There's no John Hancock, no Sam Adams, and they ultimately burn down the storage facility and turn around on their way back to Boston. And this is where Minutemen start popping out of behind walls, behind brush cover. The Minutemen are using guerrilla warfare tactics where they're not in a row firing at the British, but rather concealed behind different objects and such, and are able to wound 174 British and kill 73. Tensions have not resolved. It's time for the Second Continental Congress to convene. Delegates are sent from all the different colonies. While convened, the Battle of Bunker Hill takes place, June 17th, 1775. The story here is that the American colonists fortify a stronghold on top of Breed's Hill, which is right next door to Bunker Hill, and erroneously this battle gets named Bunker Hill. But on Breed's Hill, the Americans have the high ground. They take out way more British. 226 British are killed and 828 are wounded. The Battle of Bunker Hill is perceived as this morale-boosting moment for American colonists, where they see that if things do go south and a war does break out officially, they might have a chance at fighting for independence. Meanwhile, in the Second Continental Congress, they write up a list of grievances towards Parliament and the King. They agree that to raise money and a continental army. They look to George Washington to be commander-in-chief of them. A month after Bunker Hill, this Second Continental Congress also writes the Olive Branch Petition. This document is a last effort by the colonists to patch things up. The response from King George III is not a good one. He declares them open and avowed in rebellion. Now there's no turning back. And this is where the Continental Congress will double down on independence. Unfortunately, the rest of the British colonists in the Americas are probably not on board with that. So how do we get them on that same wavelength? Well, a couple things will happen. January 10th of 1776, Thomas Paine, an immigrant from Europe that came here to the Americas, publishes a 55-page pamphlet called Common Sense. He uses a lot of metaphors. In the musical Hamilton, they reference those. Why should a tiny island across the sea regulate the price of tea? This common sense appeals to Americans in a much more broad, kind of across-the-boards way, and people start to come a little bit more closer to understanding that they could and should be independent. The Continental Congress gives Thomas Jefferson and an elite group of guys, including Ben Franklin and John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, they give them the go-ahead to write this Declaration of Independence. The Declaration's purpose is to officially declare that we are going to be an independent nation. And College Board actually likes to point out a second kind of purpose and outcome, that it's sending a message that America is single and ready to mingle. It's out there for allying with other potential enemies of Britain. France, they're looking at you. And ultimately, France will. July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress votes on a motion for independence against Britain, and it passes. 2 days later, the Declaration of Independence on July 4th is accepted as this official document declaring this independence, and it's read outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia to congregating crowds there, and now we are officially going to be at war with Great Britain. In the next video, we talk about the philosophical foundations of this movement for independence.